Question number 7, Charles CHAUVEL.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change Issues and asks, does he have confidence in the economic modelling used to inform the government's decision on the 2020 emissions target?
The Hon Dr NICK SMITH.
Mr Speaker, yes, but I also acknowledge that macroeconomic modelling in this area is inherently difficult. There are significant unknowns around the price of carbon and the extent to which other countries will constrain their emissions. The assumptions behind the analysis are reasonable, and NZIER and Infometrics are both reputable economic analysts. Treasurys' analysis, which I've released today, was very similar and in fact recommended a considerably lower target because they were concerned about the cost on the New Zealand economy.
Charles CHAUVEL.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister agree with Dr Hugh Sadler that it is inherently contradictory to use a general equilibrium model to determine the impact of a carbon price? And how does he justify commissioning analysis on the 2020 emissions reduction target that is, quote, incapable of describing the way in which real economies can and do respond to changes in selected input costs, like a price on carbon?
The Honourable Dr NICK SMITH.
I think it was important for the government to do some economic analysis so that when we balance the ambitiousness of the target, that we have some realism about what the costs are on the economy. I acknowledge that such macroeconomic analysis is difficult, but if we are to make a well-informed decision, it's proper that the analysis was done.
Aaron Gilmore.
Supplementary to the Minister. What reports has the Minister received on the claims by Charles CHAUVEL that the government had cynically and blatantly misled the public with the dubious cost estimates done by NZIER and Infometrics of approximately $30 per week at 2020, when in fact the cost was 1/10 of this, spread over 10 years?
Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Darren Hughes.
Ask you what responsibility the Minister's got for a member of the Labor Party with the way that question was.
Point of order.
I don't think I need. If I recollect the question asked correctly, he asked what reports the Minister had received on the statement. Now, the Minister is at liberty to answer a question like that, so long as he doesn't go into detail in criticising himself what the opposition member may have said. Honourable Dr NICK SMITH.
Mr Speaker, yes, I have received reports from both Infometrics and NZIER, who were both stunned by the elementary mistake that was made by Charles CHAUVEL in his claims. Of course, the reduction in gross real national disposable income cannot be divided by 10 because it happens to be an estimate in 2020, and I suggest members opposite do some elementary mathematics.
Charles CHAUVEL. Charles CHAUVEL.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How can the Minister claim to have confidence in the modelling, given that it didn't take into account 1. likely increases in new forestry plantings, 2. comparable action to be taken by other countries, 3. benefits from improved domestic energy efficiency, or 4. the adoption of new low-carbon technologies in New Zealand? And will he accept that he has overstated the costs when more appropriate modelling would have shown that deeper emissions cuts were possible at relatively modest cost?
Honourable Dr NICK SMITH.
The simple point I would make to Labor is this. If reducing emissions was so easy and so inexpensive, why did they go up in every single year that Labor was the government? I'd further point out that the Treasury analysis of the costs would actually suggest that that done by Infometrics and NZIER is conservative. The third point I'd make is that the member is incorrect in saying that the analysis did not include the impact of what other countries would do. It specifically addressed that point.
David Garrett.
Supplementary to the Minister, does he agree with the NZIER Infometrics report to the ETS Select Committee that a price of $100 a tonne for carbon would still leave emissions 20% above 1990 levels? And what price has he been advised would be needed to take New Zealand 20% below 1990 levels by 2020, or doesn't he know?
Honourable Dr NICK SMITH.
Mr Speaker, I think it's very important for the member to recognise the difference between an emissions reduction target and a responsibility target. Because what has been debated and what is being agreed in the international forums around climate change is a responsibility target. That is, that New Zealand has the option either to reduce emissions, to deal with sinks such as forestry, or to buy units internationally. The NZEI Infometrics analysis was based on a responsibility target, and that is proper because that is what the debate is about.
Point of order, David Garrett.
The question was quite precise. Does he agree with the report's figure of $100 a tonne to keep emissions at 2020 levels, or 20% above, and what price has he been advised? The question doesn't go anywhere near responsibility targets or whatever the other label the Minister gave it.
I'll hear the point of order, speaking the point of order, the Hon Dr Nick Smith.
The point I'm making to the member is that the 10 to 20% target that the government has tabled at the international negotiations does not necessarily equate to a reduction in emissions in New Zealand, and that's why his question is incorrect, in that New Zealand has the option under the international model to buy units at the international carbon price.
I think it would have order. In dealing with the point of order raised by David Garrett, it would appear that the Minister is disputing the information that the member provided in the first part of his question, and the Minister doesn't need to answer the second part. Aaron Gilmore, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister. Has the Minister received any reports in response to the claim that the 10 to 20% target relative to 1990 would result in New Zealand facing trade penalties from North America?
The Honourable Dr Nick
Speaker,
Smith.
Yes, I've been flabbergasted by the claims that New Zealand's 10 to 20% target would, according to Mr CHAUVEL, result in New Zealand facing trade barriers and tariffs from North America. The reason it's extraordinary is that the United States is a target which is actually 0% as compared with our minus 10 to 20, or Canada, which has tabled a target of minus 3% relative to 1990. It would be extraordinary, and I say a disservice to New Zealand, that the opposition is making claims of tariff barriers when New Zealand is going significantly further than either of the North American major countries.
Charles CHAUVEL.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why does the government continue to present climate change policy as a trade-off between economic and environmental outcomes, and in doing so ignoring the fact that the future costs of failing to avoid large-scale climate change greatly exceed the costs of starting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions now?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Speaker, quite simply because the repeated claims by members of the opposition that New Zealand can radically reduce emissions and there's absolutely no cost is off in fairyland. And this government is taking a realistic approach of balancing the economic and environmental challenges associated with climate change.
Question number 8, Dr Russell Norman.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
In the Minister's answers, he referred to some reports that he had from Infometrics and NZIER. I wonder if those are official documents, and if so, I'd ask the Minister to table them.
Order. Only if the Minister was quoting from the documents would he be required to table them. So I have to ask the Minister, was he quoting from official documents?
I'm more than happy. They are on the public arena, publicly released by the government 2 weeks ago. If it would please the member, I'd be happy to table them.
Order. It seems that the member is perfectly happy to provide those documents. Dr Russell Norman.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
In relation to this question, there's a typographical error. It should say developed countries, not developed counties.
I accept the member's point, of course. Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change Issues and asks, did New Zealand tell the Bonn Climate Change Conference that the government's emissions reduction target of 10 to 20% below 1990 levels is dependent on developed countries as a whole cutting their emissions to 30 to 40% below 1990 levels?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
No, the 10 to 20% target range is dependent on comparable efforts by developed countries. I would note that to date other countries have announced target ranging from the United States of a 0% or stabilisation at 1990 levels through to the European Union that has promised reductions of between 20 and 30%. The conditionality around New Zealand's target range is broadly comparable to that set by Australia of a 15 to 25% reduction on 2000 levels, taking into account different baselines and economic circumstances.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister denying that when the New Zealand negotiated